Welcome everyone. Today, I'm going to talk about something which is at the center of the studio that I'm teaching at the University of Waterloo with third-year undergraduate students. We're working with the Kensington Market Community Land Trust to design infill housing in Kensington Market. So what is infill as relational architecture? I'm going to start with thinking about what urban infill is. With infill building, new construction fits into available space, be that of a single lot or an entire block in the existing city. It often uses historically evolved low-rise, high-density housing types such as the row house and the perimeter block. Greeting rather than confronting the fabric, these buildings reestablish the physical continuity of the city as they tie new construction to the city's past. This establishes a visual dialogue that comments vividly on the relationship between old and new buildings, while it preserves the city as the physical emblem of human memory. So this is Marta Gutman, who I think is the director of the City University in New York right now. But in the 1980s, she edited this book with Ghislaine Hermanus and Richard Pluntz called Reweaving the Urban Fabric: Approaches to Infill Housing, which looked at a competition in the mid-80s to imagine infill housing in New York City. And I think her definition gives you a very good sense of a deeply architectural definition of infill building in the city. I also really like this other editor, sorry, not the editor, but Peter Marcuse, who we've already used in the Superstudio in our launch event. Peter Marcuse and David Madden's work on In Defense of Housing. Peter Marcuse argues that infill housing is the opposite of slum clearance and displacement. It represents integration of buildings and their residents into the urban fabric, not their separation and exclusion. It represents respect for existing lifestyles and social patterns, rather than arrogant and elitist efforts to reform the poor and benighted. Given the present political context, this is in the 80s, under Reaganism in the US, in which the isolation and neglect of the poor, of minority group members, of household patterns not conforming to the conservative mainstream are the watchwords. Infill housing is a slogan of resistance and progress. And so I really like this definition. It's not exclusively architectural, partly because Peter Marcuse is more of a planning theorist than an architect, but it's explicitly political and it's explicitly social. And it really defines infill as a project of relating people within the city. And so I think we should bear this definition in mind as we move forward. But I am going to show a number of examples of of a more architectural sense of urban infill. So even within the studio that I'm teaching, we're doing an exercise right now that looks at different options for density within urban fabric. And here I argue that infill housing is a process of densification through the introduction of new built form into already built up urban areas while retaining existing buildings. It is primarily concerned with the following issues: preserving existing built form for social, historical, and environmental reasons. And maybe that's the primary idea, but it also requires relating new and existing construction in both section and in height, and relating new and existing construction in plan in order to form logical internal and external connections and spaces. So infill emerges in response to modernist architecture in the 1960s and 1970s. And just to give you a sense in Toronto of what was happening before that, in the 1930s, we have some ideas about urban renewal and slum clearance in what will become Regent Park. Here on the right-hand side, a kind of photo montage showing new buildings replacing a blighted fabric in Regent Park. Here's another version of this same problem, Eugene Faluti's drawings of South Cabbagetown and the potential for a new design that would have nothing to do with the block structure of the existing city. nor would it have anything to do with the existing buildings. So these are tabula rasa approaches that are typical of mid-20th century modernism. And this is an early version of the final design for Regent Park, but you can see it completely separates this mega block from the fabric around it and is exactly the opposite of infill. In Toronto, we have other examples that are market examples, like Flemington Park, which is a suburban greenfield site where new buildings were built. So modernism tended to focus on greenfield sites, or if it focused on urban sites, it involved the destruction of existing built form and the proposition of new built form. So in the mid-20th century, a number of people started to question this approach to the existing city. And infill is kind of a result of that. Here's one other example of this, the site for City Hall. And you can see an existing fabric completely erased and the proposal for new buildings in that space. In the 1950s, Saverio Muratori in Italy began to look at the existing, this is actually the urban morphology in Venice, but looked at the existing city and tried to trace existing built form and existing property lines in order to understand how urban morphology evolved over time. Other Italians like Aldo Rossi and Giorgio Grassi made similar studies of the existing built form of cities. And so these Italians started a movement called neo-rationalism, or it's sometimes called tendency or tendenza, which really looked to try to understand how to build in the present by studying the fabric of the existing city and building within it. Many of the projects that they actually proposed were not exclusively infill at this time, but they were examining existing structures and valorizing those structures. This tendenza movement also moved to France, and there were a number of architects in France like Bernard Huet, Christian de Villers, Antoine Grumbach, and each of them started to take on a similar analysis of the existing city and tried to think of how buildings could be inserted within the existing city rather than replacing the existing city with a tabula rasa approach. So this is a kind of a late example from the 80s. And I'll jump a little bit to the early 70s. So there's the tendenza approach, which in some way was highly critical of modernism. There was another approach, which was maybe more aligned with modernism, more inside modernism, and yet still opposed to it. And that was the work of Team 10. So Team 10 was a group of younger architects who were part of CIAM, the Congress International of Architecture Moderne. And they were very interested in the vernacular city and tried to think about how architecture could reflect the dynamics and daily life of existing cities, even if it was modern. And Aldo van Eyck was a key part of Team 10. So this example of infill in Amsterdam, this Mother's House example, is an interesting piece of building that builds a set of housing inside the mid-block while continuing the facade of the street. Long before that, Van Eyck began an infill project that wasn't with built form, but with playgrounds. And so in some ways, this is a very early example of infill in which the bombed out fabric of Amsterdam after the Second World War, it was expensive to build buildings. And there were these gaps that created a blighted neighborhood. And so Van Eyck was tasked with designing playgrounds that could be placed, hundreds of playgrounds that could be placed throughout the city in these abandoned lots. And that was a way of infilling the fabric of the city. Sorry, I have a bit of a out of order here, but this is another image of the Mother's House project, which just shows the continuity of the facade, but also the the modern articulation and color that really makes it stand out while it still fits in and fills in the fabric. Another interesting example of this from Team 10 is Giancarlo De Carlo. De Carlo had been working in Urbino throughout the 60s and done some very interesting work fitting the University of Urbino into the hills around the historic city of Urbino. But in the late 60s, he was tasked with designing the School of Education for the University of Urbino within the fabric of the historic city. And so this building is nestled inside this historic hill town and is a very interesting example of a modern building that is beautifully infilled within a medieval fabric. Here are some plans of De Carlo's building. And here's something by De Carlo here. So De Carlo's famous for his work with participatory architecture. He wrote a very important text about architecture and participation in the early 1970s. And he argues, they accused me of everything, and particularly of having betrayed the principle of the modern movement enunciated by Le Corbusier and encoded by his exegetes. I asked that my architecture, like all the architectures that have qualities, is considered as the result of forces coming from many directions, forces that are a real expression of the features of the places and cultures of their inhabitants. So De Carlo argues for not a pre-given form for architecture, but a kind of processual architecture which develops out of the context and the people who live in a place. And many of De Carlo's projects really worked very closely with residents to produce the architecture. And I think De Carlo was a very political figure, and his politics were broadly anarchist politics. He really believed in a very horizontal approach to organizing, one that didn't deny the expertise of the architect, but at the same time really brought everybody who was involved in habitation of buildings into the process of building. So I think in many ways, his approach is very informative for a contemporary infill approach, which is relational and which fights against housing alienation. Another Dutch architect who was at the fringes of Team 10, Herman Hertzberger, is also an excellent infill architect. And this project, the Haarlemmer housing, is he and his collaborators, Van Herk and Nagelkerke, created a Woonwurf, or like a pedestrianized street. And one of the things that Hertzberger is really good at is designing the porches and entries and common spaces of apartment buildings. So here, it's not a very accessible building, but it's a building that has a lot of porch structure, and it allows children to come out into the street, people to really activate the street, along with access and cars. Here's another example in Berlin. Hertzberger made a couple of really beautiful buildings in the IBA, which was an international building exhibition, which focused really on almost exclusively on infill in the mid-1980s in Berlin. And this Lindenstrasse housing completes the corner of a block. This rounded building completes the existing block. But again, the entry spaces and indoor-outdoor spaces are really amazing examples of breaking through the ecological alienation of the building, but also the social alienation that buildings contain. So this, I'm showing a set of images that come from the book that Pluntz and Gutmann and their collaborator edited. They have a little catalog of infill examples. And this is a public housing project, infill project by Lucien Kroll in France. And in it, he's interested in the landscape between buildings and building new buildings between these modernist slabs. So most of the infill projects we've looked at so far have been in traditional contexts, in pre-modern urban contexts, but it's quite possible to do infill in modernist contexts as well. And this is another image of what Kroll imagined in this very modern public housing project. He imagined adding these additions that would allow people to have choice, freedom, and would somehow activate what was a very austere and inhuman form of architecture. So I've shown a number of examples, a lot of them from the late 70s and 80s. And I presented a kind of European narrative of infill. And I think a lot of the influences do come from Europe through the Italian and French experiments. But interestingly, some of the earliest examples I could find of infill are in North America. Within the book I just described, Reweaving the Urban Fabric and Approaches to Urban Infill, the earliest ones are by John Chiardulo in New York City. So this example, these plans are sometimes a little hard to read, but here's the infill, if you can see my cursor. He's filling out a block here in Red Hook in Brooklyn with this 3-story infill building with yards. Or here's another version where a set of buildings are scattered around a couple of blocks to fill in the block structure and create a muse through these internal spaces. But in Toronto, there were some very early and important examples of infill. And that's really how I was introduced to infill, through my interest in the history of Toronto architecture. And one of the most important, I think, experimenters with infill in Toronto was the firm of Diamond and Myers, Jack Diamond and Barton Myers. And in 1967, this is earlier than all the examples we've looked at so far, they designed York Square, which is not really housing, but it involves a number of existing buildings on Avenue Road and a number of lots in Yorkville, and the construction of a U-shaped building by tearing down a few house lots and in the backyards of these houses on Avenue Road. So in the end, they created a very urban perimeter block by basically adding in the backyards of single-family homes. And so they really transformed the Toronto fabric of, in this case, single-family homes into a much more urbane and in some ways maybe European model of architecture. This is a view of it from the outside of the block. And this is another example of infill. It's hard to see from this view. This is actually the Chinese consulate in Toronto, but it used to be it was built as the Ontario Medical Association building in the early 1970s. And this is a third example, also by Diamond and Myers, which is just a house, which fits into a set of a neighborhood of small 2-story cottages. And this is a drawing that was done by Bruce Kuwabara and Barry Sampson. Bruce Kuwabara of KPMB and Barry Sampson of Baird Sampson Newark. They wrote an article together about the work of Diamond and Myers. And in the article, they published these drawings, which show the idea behind these 3 buildings that I just showed. You can see on the top, you have York Square with the existing buildings, facades added to the existing buildings, and then a U-shaped building added in the backyard. The Ontario Medical Association building with an existing house in the back of the lot and a U-shaped building on the front of the lot. And then this house, which fits into an existing neighborhood. And in each case, you see in black the courtyard that's formed in the center. So central to their ideas about infill, we're creating urban spaces within existing blocks through the construction of courtyards. In the late 60s and early 70s, there was a lot of urban activism in Toronto, activism against the destruction of neighborhoods through the extension of the Spadina Expressway. which would have destroyed a lot of buildings in the Annex neighborhood. Jane Jacobs had moved to the city and was very active in these protests. And also there were protests against the destruction of buildings on the east side of downtown, where there was a lot of urban renewal underway. An example of this was on the east side of downtown. So this is Yonge Street, this is Avenue Road, and you can see a lot of areas where houses were to be demolished to accommodate expanding core uses, parking, institutions, and commercial. And then there were also many areas where houses were replaced by private high-density apartments. So there was a lot of demolition in this part of the city. And in the early 1970s, St. Jamestown, which was the densest neighborhood in Canada, the developers of St. Jamestown were interested in building a St. Jamestown South. And they began to block bust, buy houses and tear them down to frighten neighbors into selling their properties. And so at that time, Diamond and Myers made some drawings to illustrate the problem. So on the left-hand side, you see the existing high-rise buildings at the time in the early 1970s on the east side of downtown. And on the right-hand side, you see the doomsday scenario that they imagined, in which pretty much all of the residential fabric on the east side of downtown would be demolished for high-rise buildings. So they essentially have taken St. Jamestown and just copied it south. And one of the examples of this was in the Dundas-Sherbourne neighborhood. A developer had bought this whole block, and Diamond and Myers photographed the block to show the quality of existing buildings, the historic importance of existing buildings. The proposal of the developer was to build a couple of towers on this land. And Diamond and Myers wanted to create an alternative to that. And so they designed this building in 1975 called Dundas-Sherbourne Housing. It's sometimes also called Sherbourne Lanes. And essentially what it did is it built a six-story building in the backyards of a set of houses on one side of Sherbourne. So it retained all the houses in complete form, and in the backyards built a small apartment building, which had units that were lane accessed on the bottom two floors and then gallery accessed on the top two floors. So you had 3 two-story maisonettes. So this building is quite interesting. It really fits into the existing fabric. And when you're on Sherbourne, you can barely see it, despite the fact that it's 6 stories tall. And it doesn't use a whole block. It packs the space between a laneway and Sherbourne Street, which is why it's called Sherbourne Lanes. It also produces another laneway between the backs of the houses and the new building. And this is a social space for the whole development. So Sherbourne Lanes is on the right in this image, and it was built in 1975. Even before Sherbourne Lanes, Jerome Markson had built Pembroke Sherbourne housing. So actually I didn't put them together, but the curve of Dundas Street that you see at the bottom of the image on the right-hand side is the same curve of Dundas that you see at the top of the image on the left-hand side. And you can see here, this is Pembroke housing. It's a set of U-shaped buildings, and it goes all the way from Sherbourne to Pembroke Street. So it's another very interesting example of infill in which existing buildings are kept and mid-rise building is inserted into the existing fabric. This is a street view of the Pembroke Sherbourne housing. So it wasn't just Diamond and Myers, it was other architects. And Jerome Markson was an older architect who George Baird had worked with in the past, and had done some very interesting work in the center city with Alexandra Park Public Housing. Okay, a final really important example by Diamond and Myers is Hydroblock. Hydroblock is similar to the Sherbourne Lanes, but it uses a whole block rather than a half block. And so it bought up a series of houses along St. George, and then between Baldwin Street and a couple other streets I can't remember the names of, they built a U-shaped block of apartments, which have maisonettes on the lower floors. I don't know if I have a picture of that here. You have access to lower level units, two-story street access units, and then there's a single loaded gallery, which accesses 2 stories above. So it's typologically very interesting, like stacking this single loaded corridor on top of a set of street accessed townhouses. But it really fits into the existing residential context, and it includes retail buildings, and it also includes a house on the corner. So sorry. So if we look at these three, the middle example here is Hydroblock, and you can see it in plan on the right. It's a U-shaped building, but you can see in the southeast corner an existing house that's retained. It takes a corner out of the U. And then Sherburne Lanes, which is a much tighter arrangement, 35 to 48 feet, but maybe even smaller at certain points, the dimension between the existing houses and the infill building. So you have these two models. And then they also put a set of laneway buildings. And the laneway debates in Toronto started a long time ago. And they started in the 70s. And they finally were realized as of right in the last couple of years. So it's been a long battle to create these laneway houses, but you could see Diamond and Myers advocating for them back in the mid-1970s. So alongside the work of Diamond and Myers, the work of George Baird was very important in Toronto. And this is a document called Built Form Analysis that Baird did alongside a set of design guidelines for the downtown area. But in the Built Form Analysis, he looked at existing buildings in the downtown that were working well and were typologically interesting, and then made proposals for typical buildings that could be inserted into the existing fabric that would be good public actors. Baird was interested in not making towers in the park, but making buildings that reinforced the street wall and created enclosed spaces for residents in the back. So they really clarified the relationship between public space and private spaces. And so I think this whole document, Built Form Analysis, proposes a set of infill buildings that are quite interesting. But Baird was also involved in St. Lawrence housing. And St. Lawrence housing is not exactly infill, but it is a very important housing project in the city that looked at how to integrate public housing into the existing block structure. And George was specifically a collaborator on the block study. So the block study looked at what dimensions different blocks should be to create continuity with the existing city. Should they be 300 feet? Should they be 200 feet? So in the 300-foot block structure, you have continuity, but you have much bigger blocks. And so the question was, what can you fit on 300 and 200-foot blocks, and which was more appropriate? And in order to do that, they looked at traditional blocks in the city in different places, including in the annex. And they virtually infilled as a way of studying what could happen in St. Lawrence housing. So they're not actually proposing to build this here, but they're showing how when there's a laneway, you can produce twice as many houses. And so they were looking at how you can really pack these typical Toronto blocks. And then they studied these same things in section to understand overshadowing and light. And they ended up with this mix here, where we have 300-foot blocks and we have 200-foot blocks. And they also decided on the location of a central park. The park could have been a buffer to the railway, but they decided it'd be better actually to use buildings as buffers and to really place the park space in the center of the neighborhood to create a spine down the middle. So St. Lawrence was, it involved many, many collaborators, but it's really an iconic and important example of affordable housing in Canada, and certainly in Toronto. And this is a view of the first and second and third phases. This is the third phase here, I think. Also in the late 70s, George Baird and Barton Myers published a special issue of Design Quarterly called Vacant Lottery. And in it, you can see some diagrams by Barton Myers. So he shows, like, for the Ontario Medical Association building, we could have made this box. For York Square, we could have made this box. These are the densities of these two buildings. But instead, we made these forms that really create space. The building forms space. For Sherburne Lanes, we could have built a tower, but instead we knocked the tower on its side to create this block that includes existing buildings. We created infill housing. So I think you can see that there's been a lot of innovation in the city of Toronto around this question of infill, and it's an important tradition that began in the 1970s and really influences architecture in Toronto to this day. George, within the issue of Vacant Lottery, wrote a text called Theory, Vacant Lots in Toronto, where he studies the history of lot division over time, showing the way lots became smaller in the 19th century, and then were consolidated and became bigger in the 20th century, kind of reducing some of the freedom that the small lot structure allowed, and allowed for the construction of much larger buildings. This is just a typological study that shows the way building types respond to lot sizes and consolidation. You can have a house and you can have an apartment building on the same narrow lot, or you can consolidate a whole series of those lots to create a building that's much, much larger, that's parallel to the street rather than perpendicular to the street. So I've been talking about urban infill in a certain way as it was defined in the late 60s and early 70s to talk about how to insert buildings into the city. But there's a whole other sense in which infill operates, and I think we should think about it in our design work. And that is architectural infill, infill within the building itself. So also in the 1960s, John Hebraken began writing about the relationship between support and infill in buildings in his book Supports. This diagram by Hebraken kind of shows the basic idea. The basic idea is that architecture has different degrees of durability, and the structure is the most durable element. And so that element is the support for the building, and it can be infilled in different ways. And his hypothesis was that it might be possible to infill in ways that were highly responsive to individual needs. So infill could be something that was highly responsive, while the support could be something which was simple and durable over time. And that could introduce a kind of radical flexibility into architecture. So this is, he set up a foundation for architectural research, the Stichting Architekten Research, or SAR. And this is one example of a product that it made, which is simply a way of playing and studying potential layouts of units within a defined space. So the structure might be defined, but the infill could be variable. And this is a set of diagrams that describes the same thing. On the left-hand side, the structure, which is somewhat fixed. On the right-hand side, the infill, which might be how washrooms might fit and how rooms might fit around those washrooms, could be much more flexible and dynamic. And here you can see some of the reasons that might be the case. So the SAR looked at the relationship between family units and needs and unit types. And so there might be reasons why it's very important to be able to change units in order to accommodate different users. And so at the heart of Hebraken's idea was that architecture needed to be more responsive to the desires and needs of people, and especially mass housing. So in some ways, he called his book Supports I forget the exact subtitle, but essentially it was an alternative to housing, to mass housing. And so he really saw the alienation of modernist mass high density social housing as a significant social problem that could be solved by thinking more flexibly about the interior and giving residents more agency within buildings. So one person who really took this up was Lucien Kroll. Lucien Kroll is a Belgian architect and anarchist who worked on this project for the medical students housing at the Catholic University in Louvain. And in it, he talked to students for quite a while about what they needed in their housing. And they made different kinds of suggestions. And the facades of the buildings reflect those suggestions, the diversity of suggestions. I've already mentioned Kroll as somebody who infilled within modernist housing, but here he's using infill in the other sense, where the interior of the building is also something that can be changeable. And interior spaces respond to exterior spaces. So all of these patios respond to interior multi-floor double height spaces. So I'm going to show a project by Frei Otto. Frei Otto is famous for his structural experiments, but he's also done a very interesting project like this, architectural project for housing that allows for this kind of uncertainty and infill. So he says any predefinition of form is basically wrong. Architecture often claims power through form, but how can we build things in such a way that this is avoided? How can we instead accept the forms that unavoidably result from the process? These are the basic ideas that have led to the Oko house or the Eco house. That he did in Berlin during the IBA. So here's the kind of site plan. Originally, there were supposed to be 3 of these houses. 2 were finally built in the 1980s during the IBA. Here's what Frei Otto designed. So this is a multi-unit residential building, but it only has 2 built floors. It's actually a 5-story building, but only 2 floors are built of concrete, and there's a staircase access. So there's access and there's 2 floors. What results are these 5 floors of housing. And here's the model. And so he worked with many architects. I'll show you the list of architects in a second. But these architects worked with the residents who would live there to design the infill within this very simple structure that sits in, it's important to note, within a set of trees. So part of the reason for what gets infilled here is the buildings get infilled within the park and the trees. So that's really what they're responding to. Otherwise, they're not responding to urban form or buildings. And here you can see the construction process. First, the basic concrete structure is built, this kind of Corbusian maison domino with double height. And then inside the double height, houses are built on each floor. So on the top floor, you can build a completely independent house from the floor below. And here's the final result. And so here's the list of architects. So there's about 10 different firms, and they were allocated different units, some of them multiple units. So I think there's 9 units in each house, 18 units in total. And this is Gunther Ludwig and Gunther Lohnhardt of Solidar in front of their model for one of these. I think it's this unit 10 here. And their architectural drawings. So Frei Otto's architectural drawings are very, very simple. The architects that work within the frame and make the infill had much more complex architectural drawings and much more complex ideas about ecological architecture. And here's another example, also in Berlin, and also from the IBA, from this International Building Exhibition, which is famous for its rationalist infill. Here we have 2 examples of this other type of infill. So Peter Strussbecker, Kel Nyland, and Christoph Putfarken built this building called Wohnregal, which means residential shelf. So very similar to the Oko house. It's a set of slabs, and you can see they're not as radically variable. They didn't use different architects. Instead, they designed a system of walls and windows that could be inset or brought out. Different windows could be combined to create different plans for each unit in the building. And here are some of the interior images of that and the basic idea. So here you have these 6 units in the building, each of which is double height. And here's the publication before it's built of a very abstracted version of the same thing. So I think I just want to finish by illustrating that infill is coming back. So I'm showing it as something which emerged in the 60s in response to modernism, had a certain kind of urban high point in the 80s during the period of the IBA. And these experiments in flexible interiors really maybe also, I showed a couple of examples from the 80s, but in some ways they were a little in the minority at that time. Really the dominant form of architecture in the 1980s was more this kind of urban contextual infill. But I think both forms of infill are returning in the present for a set of reasons. So I think this research by Bridget Shim and Donald Chong, from the early 2000s, it's very interesting. They did a studio at U of T, which was published as Sight Unseen, Laneway Architecture and Urbanism in Toronto, where they advocated for, again, buildings in laneways. Also in the early 2000s, Ontario developed the Places to Grow Act, which emphasized the green belt around the Greater Golden Horseshoe from Hamilton through Oakville and Mississauga, Toronto, Oshawa, and other cities. And it basically limits growth to some very small areas. The designated greenfield area, conceptual, is an area where you can actually build in greenfield land. But otherwise, new building has to happen within the built-up area. And so that puts a huge emphasis on infill because new building can no longer extend out into the countryside. It needs to redensify the core. In 2009, ERA architects in the city of Toronto produced the Mayor's Tower Renewal Opportunities Book. This was really work that Graham Stewart, who's a partner at ERA, developed as a student at the University of Toronto. But the idea of tower renewal is that there's a huge resource of towers in the city, and that great savings of carbon emissions and operational, both embodied and operational carbon, can be made by insulating these buildings. But equally important, there are many opportunities for infill within tower sites because they were built as buildings in parks and they have very alienating urban space around them. So the Mayor's Tower Renewal Project really advocates for the densification and construction of new infill housing around these towers. So something like Lucien Kroll's work on public housing in France is really being revived here in a context which is very different from the infill context that most infill architects are working in, or that we traditionally think of infill. We think of infill as something that works in traditional fabrics, but here it can work in a modern fabric. And here are some examples of new buildings that could create positive urban form, positive landscape, and improved housing stock. And just this last year in the city of Toronto, and I think this is true across the country, due to federal and provincial incentives, there's been a huge increase in as-of-right missing middle housing opportunities. So in Toronto, as of right, 4 units on sites throughout the city were put into place in July of 2025. And in a number of downtown central city wards, up to 6 units on most lots. So laneways and multiplexes became very standard forms of housing. And the city of Toronto has manuals on how to produce this kind of densification or infill density within existing fabrics. So that's another incentive. There are also interesting debates about the contextualism of infill. So this is an intervention by Smart Density, a Toronto firm, arguing against the angular planes, which attempt to step buildings down towards existing context. So many of the guidelines for mid-rise buildings in Toronto stipulate angular planes that bring the heights of buildings down towards streets or down towards residential fabrics. And there's a big debate in the city right now about whether that is too costly. And I think it has interesting implications on questions of infill. How do you, if infill is about creating relationships, how do we create relationships without these stepped planes? And John Van Nostrand is, I think, an interesting architect in Toronto who's been thinking a lot about this Dutch Habraken's approach to infill. This was a proposal for a condominium that in Hamilton, which was never built, but it was meant to be sold by a unit which could be multiplied. So it was a totally modular condo where you could buy plots essentially of different sizes. And it builds on some of his other work, like the Pro Home, where he imagined building on the back of a lot, a small house, and then building on the front of the house and densifying lots over time. So John's work has been very, for a long time, been thinking about evolutionary housing. And I think finally something like Pritzker Prize winners Lacaton and Vassal and their collaboration with Frederic Drouot, looking at towers and how to infill towers architecturally to create choice for people, to create agency for people. So the Tour Bois-le-Pretre is one of their examples, in which they add a facade on the outside of the building, they add a balcony, and then they add glazing, and then they add a balcony in front of the balcony to greatly expand the living space, and importantly, expand it in ways that are unprogrammed. So adding a kind of unprogrammed space to the apartment, free space. So I just want to end by thinking about infill as relational architecture. Alienation, as we know in this studio, means feeling not at home. And our interest within this whole studio is to end housing alienation in Canada. And I think infill as a form of relational architecture is one important tool that we can mobilize to fight against housing alienation. AHA has talked about this at different moments. We draw on the work of Patrick Stewart and the Luma Native Housing Society to think about how Indigenous people think about home in terms of land, culture, and identity. And how can housing be disalienated by thinking about it in these terms? If we are alienated from the ecological, social, and even our psychological worlds through housing, how can we reconnect or re-relate these things through the way we design housing? And in the early 2000s, I wrote this essay, Possible Strategies for Relational Architecture, which started with this quote from Lygia Clark. Lygia Clark is not an architect. She's a sculptor and Brazilian sculptor. And her work, though, was about creating relational objects that would get people together, bring people together to collaborate on things. So how can architecture, I think her work is very inspiring. It was very spatial and architectural. And I think she can serve as a kind of point of inspiration for us to think about how architecture can be something which relates us to each other, to ourselves, and to the environment around us. And I know I'm pretty much at time. I just wanted to give a couple of examples of how infill can be politicized and it can be used towards social aims. This is a project that I worked on with a number of other people many of whom are part of Open Architecture Toronto and the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. in which we looked at a site directly north of Pembroke Lanes, the Jerome Markson project, directly south of Sherbourne Lanes on Sherbourne, which is currently empty. And the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty was adamant that it needed to be built for social housing. And so we actually met with community members to talk about what was needed. And we showed different versions of this, of a possible building. And people really argued that it was important to maximize the area dedicated to housing. So even though they were interested in maintaining connection to the street, having communal open spaces, providing a range of mid-rise and high-rise buildings, and respecting the surrounding environment, it was very important to maximize housing. And so the scheme that we came up with involved aspects of some of the different versions that were shown to the community, but it included a large residential tower. So I think this is an interesting infill building, which relates where its base building relates well to the existing context, keeps an existing house in place, but also adds a lot of density to the site, which is in its own way compatible with the context. So you can see the model and the demonstration that took the model to City Hall. But I think also the land trust is an interesting tool for thinking about infill. Land trusts across the country are buying existing buildings and inserting themselves within existing neighborhoods. And so I think infill is a very important tool for thinking about how land trusts can relate to existing contexts. The Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust has bought a number of buildings in Parkdale, inserted throughout the fabric, infilled throughout the fabric. And they're working with Levitt Goodman architects on how to improve these buildings and even add to them. As part of Architects Against Housing Alienation and a project that I was involved in with Gentrification Tax Action, we looked at a building on Jameson Avenue, and Levitt Goodman architects proposed a series of infill strategies for that building that would add public space, add onto the facade, and add onto the roof. So these are infill additions, which allow residents more freedom within the unit. And you can see the final version. And in order to fund this, we believe it's important that the value produced in the neighborhood through real estate transactions is captured in the neighborhood and reinvested locally. So Gentrification Tax Action proposed a gentrification tax that would decline over time from about 26% in the first year to less than 10% by year once you've owned a home for 20 years. But it essentially taxes the increase in the value of the home at the point of sale. And it takes that money and invests it in social housing in the neighborhood in the form of land trusts and cooperatives. And this studio that we're involved in here is a collaboration with the Kensington Market Community Land Trust. And one of the reasons we're looking at infill is because Kensington itself is a space, very important space of infill. It's a space where the whole urban structure of the market is the product of a gradual infilling, first by awnings and canopies, and then by structures that come out onto the front yard and extend buildings out to the street. So it has a very clear structure of infill architecturally. But Kensington also is a very interesting urban fabric that has a lot of infill within the block. So many of these blocks have streets and many houses, not on the streets themselves, but within the mid-block. And so this practice of infill is something that we're taking inspiration from this local context to design new forms of infill. So thanks, everyone, and I hope you consider infill as a tool for producing relational architecture.
Thank you, Adrian. That was fantastic. Would we like to do a couple minutes for questions if anyone has them? It was really, I thought that was, I enjoyed that very much. Very, very informative. Wow. I learned a lot. Please, if anyone has a question, we're all together. There's no such thing as a silly question. All are amazing. If you want to type it in the chat, we could read it out, or you could turn your mic on and share it with us. Please feel free.
Vincent, yes.
Hey, Adrian.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you again and hear your lecture. One thing that did come to mind when I was listening to you talk was the relationship of infill and how the friction between actors might be managed. I don't think you I mean, I also joined in a little bit halfway, unfortunately, due to some other meetings. But one thing that came to mind was how different kind of political systems or bureaucratic systems that we create for ourselves manage those frictions. Do you have any thoughts about, are there any particular directions that we should try to push towards to kind of resolve or negotiate those infill kind of relationships between these actors? So like one example, say like the land trust is kind of an overarching organization that manages those relationships within itself versus more independent kind of individual ownership of kind of townhomes and subdivision of lots as a much more fine grained but potentially more um, greater amount of friction within the ecosystem. So wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I don't know whether I'm not I'm not sure all the nuances of the way you're asking it, but I think it's a really interesting. I think the example really helps me to kind of respond. I think at the beginning, I posited two examples of two definitions of infill. Maybe I had three. I had one myself, but I don't really think the one that I was framing is really my full definition of infill at all. I think that the lecture was more my full definition of infill. But Marta Gutman's definition was very architectural, and it really applies to any infill project and the range of projects you're talking about. I think Peter Marcuse's definition was more argumentative and more specific in that he really sees infill as a way of honoring and preserving the existing social life of the city and the kind of equity of the city. And so I think it resonates with his later, more recent argument that we are so interested in about housing, residential alienation, like that so much housing is highly alienated. And of course, infill housing can be very alienated too, when it's in the private market. And if you Google infill housing, you get a planning definition actually in Wikipedia, which argues that it's often a tool of gentrification, which I think it is. I mean, I think, if we look at the breadth of Marta Gutman's definition, it can easily be used as a tool of gentrification. And I think in that way, it contributes to residential alienation. But I think that's why I'm thinking about infill as a relational architecture as something which is, I'm trying to think about how infill can be something which is relational and works against alienation. And I think the land trust is important for that because the land trust is what decommodifies the land. And we tie the concept of alienation, we see it as a qualitative thing, as a literal separation from the ecological world, the social world, and our individual agency. But we also see it as an economic problem, one about the exchangeability of housing and the kind of assetization, commodification, and financialization of housing. And so I think in order for infill to be a relational architecture, it needs to be thinking in the Peter Marcuse sense. about how land operates. And so I think, there are other models other than the land trust for sure. There's, social housing, there's other models of affordable housing. I forget exactly the model that you used in your thesis, but that may have been an affordable one. So yeah, I think the land trust is a great tool for addressing some of the conflicts that come up within the project of infill. And yeah, infill can be something which exacerbates land prices. I mean, just up the street from me, on Lansdowne, somebody did a sixplex, and they're selling it for the rental value of the 6 units, and the lot turned from a lot that was, a little over $1 million to like $3 or $4 million. So infill can be definitely a tool of residential alienation. But if we want to create a more equitable city with less conflict, then I think we need to think about it in other terms. And the land trust collaboration is key for that in my mind. Sorry, that was a long answer and not very
No, that's great.
precise, but
That was a great question, Vincent. Anyone else?
anyone from the Kensington Market Studio?
Maybe I'll ask a quick question, Adrian. So of the two kind of types of infill, infill at the site scale or the neighborhood scale versus building interior scale, as your kind of story of the return of infill, which I think is correct. I mean, the examples that we see unfolding in policy change and land use changes are at the site and neighborhood. It seems, or most of them, as far as I can tell, and certainly your examples, that and not saying one is more important than the other, but it seems at the building interior in terms of unit organization, the much more kind of radical um, version of it in terms of norms today. What do you what do you see as the sort of primary obstacles and therefore areas to work on, kind of critically and creatively, speculatively, as an architect to kind of um, achieve infill at the interior within the kind of context of today's sort of rules, regulations, cultures of building, cultures of ownership, cultures of tenure. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, yeah, I think there's both a social and a strong ecological argument, obviously, for the kind of support infill concept. I mean, maybe not in the way that some, like, let's say, Japanese metabolism imagined kind of support infill. Seemed like there was a lot of disposability in that. But I think the idea of, the importance of maintaining buildings in place and the existing embodied carbon in buildings is a strong incentive to build buildings that are highly adaptable.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in the present, there's kind of a stronger environmental argument for some of these experiments. And I also think there's an appetite for the social dimension of it. I guess what stands against it is the commodification of housing, and how, on the one hand, you'd think that some kind of a kit of parts that's highly adaptable could be commodified, and probably can. And there probably are good examples of that.
Mm-hmm.
But but I think there's also something about the predictability. I mean, I think these are things that are close to your research, Matthew. Like, the question of variation and replication. Like, there's something about Lucien Kroll's vision of what an architecture is has never been that popular because it kind of messes things up a bit.
Mhm.
And that is, I think, in its own way, decommodifying. Like it allows people so much flexibility that the commodity form becomes damaged somehow in the process. Like people are using it too much. It's too used.
Yeah,
I don't know. That might be one of the challenge. I just think that's one of the challenges
for
of it
sure. Yeah.
in the present.
Super, super interesting. Yeah. Well, maybe we also don't want to keep people too long, unless there's a last minute hand that goes up or screen that turns on. Maybe this is a good time to wrap things up.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone. It's great to have you here, Adrian. That was really fascinating. Please, everyone, come next week to Barry John's talk. He's got some fascinating ideas that overlap with what Adrian's been talking about today. A project called Backfill, which he's really sort of figuring out how to do exciting non-alienated housing infill projects in a very conceptually rich way, but very practically working on deploying them. So, yes, thank you. Sarah has just put the full series as it stands now
Yep.
up on the screen.
Yep. And we'll put Barry's link into the Instagram bio for people to find for next week too.
Great.
Thank you, Adrian. That was
Bye, everyone.
fantastic. Thanks everyone for coming.
Bye.